originally called the F.R.O. It was the Forward Research Office, and then it changed to the F.R.U. And it comes about again in the late 1970s. This is when the big shift happens. And there's someone called Jimmy Glover. Jimmy Glover, who's flown into the region. He becomes the commander land forces, and he's the number 2 for the British Army in terms of day-to-day operations. He's basically in charge, and he's the one who's convinced that intelligence is going to play an important part in bringing peace to the region. That's his approach. A lot of other people, a lot of other senior army officers really disagree. They think intelligence, waste of time, no need putting resources into it. This is a kind of an indulgence. And you have the much more combative, hard-nosed army officers who think you shouldn't be paying someone to give you information about where a bomb is. You should just try and persuade them otherwise, or just force them to tell you. But of course, that's not always going to work, or it's not always going to be that effective. So Glover comes in. He has a different approach. And what he does is he takes these 3 agent-running army units and he brings them together into one for the first time. So now, for the first time, the army has this centrally run unit called the F.R.U, and they begin to have more power. So they don't report to their immediate superiors within their brigade. They report indirectly to him, and if someone's asking one of these people, what are you doing? They don't have to answer to other people in their brigade. So they have more autonomy. But already, just in that tiny detail, you can begin to see the seed of something else, this sense that no one's really watching what we're doing. No one's really providing oversight. Maybe we can get away with things. You mentioned the MRF. They, I think, were a really extreme example of an army unit which went off the reservation, which just, I mean, some of the stories about them are really, really hard to understand in terms of just how wild they appear to have been. So the F.R.U. was different in some senses, but at the same time, there was still within it this sense that they could ever so slightly get away with things. They could do things differently. They could be their own unit. And what they start to do is take on agents either close to or within both the IRA, the officials, but also some Protestant loyalist groups as well, but not quite as many. So they're not only focused on Republican groups, but that is definitely where kind of more of their resources are being put. And what sets them apart? Basically, their tradecraft is different, and they put more work into trying to recruit an agent. That's the big, big difference. So they spend more time researching the background of this agent. They're more ingenious in terms of how they recruit people. And I guess a good example of this is what happened with Frank Hegarty. And he's the guy at the heart of 4 Shots in the Night. And he's someone who was approached early one morning in 1980. And he was out walking his dog. And I don't want to give away too much. Maybe I'll save the kind of bulk of this story for the book. But the F.R.U. had done research into his home life, his partner, his kids, the name of his dog, whether his dog had done well in a greyhound race that had taken part in a couple of weeks earlier. In other words, when one of their men finally gets to speak to Frank on this dog walk early one morning, he knows not so much everything, but he knows a lot about Frank. And that changes everything. I mean, Frank is obviously, for a moment, he's confused. Who is this guy I've never met? How does this guy know so much about me? But at the same time, and look, any one of us can imagine what that feels like. You're intrigued. Why does this person know so much about me? But this person obviously thinks I'm special. This person obviously sees something in me that other people might not. I want to know more. And that's really interesting. So they're better on the psychology of an agent recruitment. And they just have more resources to put into it. And I think those are some things that really set them apart from what the army was doing earlier in the Troubles.
You pointed out in the book, it was very interesting that quite often the actual act of passing the information that you were gathering was a lot more dangerous than being in the organization, actually gathering it.
Mm,
We mentioned Steak Knife there. Canova came out a couple of weeks ago. The closest thing in Canova we got to specific examples were like these 6 anonymized operational failings.
mm,
One of which a handler was meeting an agent in an indiscreet location, raised suspicions, agent got killed because of it. There was another one
mm,
where the handler's car got like ID'd by the IRA as being security forces. They knew that but didn't swap it out. And
mm,
that resulted in an agent dying also. You
mm.
might, with that in mind, you might tell us about these so-called Spielberg productions
Yeah.
that they would use to ensure that didn't happen.
Yeah, this is so you're absolutely right. This is the local police, the special branch would often tease or just sort of make fun of the army for putting so much effort into exactly what would happen when they met their agents. So I'll give you an example of a kind of typical F.R.U meeting with an agent. So they would never tell their agent to stay in one particular place. They'd never say, right, meet us on the corner of this street and that street. Just, stand there and we'll come along and pick you up. They'd always have instead what was called a moving meet. So instead, they give the agent a stretch of a stretch of road, let's say, to walk along. Say, look, here's a mile of road. Make sure you're walking along this road at such and such a time. And then what they do is drive a van along that same stretch and then have someone in the back of the van who could open the door, and then the agent could hop in almost without the van ever coming to a standstill. So they're picking the agent up incredibly quickly. And, even if somebody does see this guy getting into, or woman, but usually it's a guy getting into the back of the van, that doesn't look too unusual. It's usually they choose places where you could imagine someone would be trying to get a lift. And public transport in many parts of Northern Ireland at that time was not great. So it's plausible. But then what they'd also do is they take huge precautions to make sure that nobody was tailing this van. So the van would go to great lengths before meeting up, but then also once they've got the agent in the back as they're driving off, they'd also go to great lengths to ensure that there's no one on their tail. And only after that do they take this agent to go and meet their handler. And this might be back in an army barracks, it might be in a nearby caravan, or who knows, or a safe house nearby. And it always makes sure that the agent had some kind of cover story so that if someone does see him in this place, they've got some kind of story to explain what they're doing there, or indeed why they disappeared for an hour that evening or that day. So they went to much greater lengths. The local police did not, and and would tease the army for doing it. But the army was insistent that this is when your agent is most vulnerable. And because so much of the intelligence they're picking up, they're not out there like a James Bond figure with a tiny camera taking pictures or anything like that. Most of the intelligence they're gathering day to day is stuff they hear. The only technology they're using is their ears. So they don't have something that can compromise them that they're going to have on their person. And they're holding it all in their head. All they've got to do is deliver it just by having a conversation with their handler. So picking the agent up is, you're absolutely right, the time when they're at their most vulnerable.
You touched on Dennis Donaldson there earlier on. I was
Mm,
hoping maybe you could tell us a little about another quite famous spy. He was once Jerry Adams' driver, Willie Carlin, who ironically was saved by Steak Knife actually once when he
mm.
eventually got rumbled.
Yeah, Willie Carlin is a really interesting character.